Well, good morning. It's very exciting to be up here. So Jeff, I have to thank you. I didn't think about this when I was thinking about my intro song. The first one that popped in my head wasn't quite your song, but as you said yours, I was like, that's actually one of the theme songs to my life, The Great Adventure. And what I love is the opening lines to the chorus is, saddle up your horses, we have a trail to blaze. Yes, and that's what I love about this group is that this is a place where we can come and be thought leaders, and to be thought leaders, we have to, think. And so that's when I proposed this topic, that's what I wanted to take you guys on a journey of some thoughts I've been having over the last few months around this topic of how do we have some of the most overachieving population of people coming into vet school when we look at the statistics of the people who get into vet school relative to the population. These are some of the most overachieving. And yet then we have that data showing up that we wouldn't recommend this profession, that we're burnout, that we have all of these issues. That's a big why. This doesn't really make sense. So to go on this journey, I want to take you back to 2012. Does anybody remember anything significant from 2012? Any events? There was an election. Obama got reelected, yeah. Anything else that happened in 2012? It's amazing, 6 years ago, and we're like, what happened? Facebook went public that year. The Olympics in London happened, and the U.S. took home the most Olympic medals. Most importantly, Gangnam Style went viral. Superstorm Sandy hit that year as well as the election. But most importantly, 2012 was the year I became a veterinarian. For 4 years, I had heard about this year, 2012, the class of 2012, and I had identified with this year for so long, and like New Year's Eve, I was like, it's here, this year I've been thinking about. And so that was the year I became a vet, and when you become a new veterinarian, there's moments where it hits you, of like, I'm a doctor now. I really am a doctor. One of those for me, I was writing some records and just sitting there, and over the intercom, it was Dr. Trichel, please call, we have an owner that needs to talk to you. And I was like, kept writing. And the tech looked at me and she's like, you gonna answer that? And I was like, oh, I have a new name now. My new name is Dr. Trichel. I had never answered to that before. And so moments like that, and then the first time that you realize that your clinical judgment saved an animal's life. That moment, and you're like, I did that. Something inside of me was able to change the course of this animal's life, which changed the course of this little girl's future, and that's meaningful. But there's other moments where you realize you're a veterinarian, and for me, it was actually my time off as an intern. Good God, that didn't happen often, but I had to go to a wedding, right? Got on a plane. And there was this moment on a plane that I didn't realize I was a veterinarian. I sat next to somebody, and you're sitting there, and like a good rookie, she asked me, what do you do? Well, I'm a veterinarian. Well, big rookie mistake, because then the rest of me and the rest of the plane, because of course she was a loud talker. So for 3 hours, we're trapped on this plane talking about her cat's diarrhea. So not only was I trapped in this conversation, there's loud talkers on the plane, you're just like, shut up, right? Now they're having to listen to a conversation about like really not so savory things that you want to be on a plane, and everyone is subject to this. Again, rookie move, didn't have the headphones to, oh yeah, thanks, okay, I gotta listen to something. So that was the moment I learned. And I remember at that moment being told this in vet school, that when you're on a plane, you're not a veterinarian. And our professor had said, he was like, I work at a Burger King. So now that I work for a bank, it's fantastic. Everybody asks me what I do. Oh, I work for a bank. What do you do? Well, I'm in lending or in marketing, et cetera, et cetera. And boop, into conversation, headphones in, and we are good to go, right? But at that moment, I realized I now have a new identity. It was a chosen identity, but it's a part of who you are, your career, and especially a veterinarian. You have a new identity of your social identity has changed. And so this idea of an identity contingency, the things that you have to deal with in a situation because you have a given social identity. And mine, in 2012, had changed. I was now a veterinarian. And of course, those conversations always go. You hear about her cat, her son's cat, her friend's cat, all of the cats in their life. And then, what does the conversation always end with, especially when they've had to interact with a veterinarian. Always wanted to be a veterinarian. Yes. So again, sadness, the pet's already passed. And then they say, and they charge me an arm and a leg. Punctuates every single one of those stories, right? Everybody's nodding. So this is a thing, right? And I kind of thought about that, and I was like, well, and I've had some other instances where other people get to experience this with me. One time I was at a pharmacy conference, and one of our lenders was there, and we were at a table of pharmacists, and he was like, oh, well, Jess is a veterinarian. And I was just like, ooh, don't say it. And then, of course, classic conversation, dog hit by a car, yada, yada, yada. Everybody is now engaged in hearing the life story of this man's pet. And, of course, punctuated with, so expensive. Right? Another time with my cousin, we were just sitting at a bar hanging out and got in one of those social conversations at the bar. And, she introduces me as a veterinarian. Here we go again. Pomeranian, all these issues, GI issues. And she looked at me after that and she was like, that happens every time, doesn't it? I said, absolutely, absolutely. And so this idea that we have this contingency of, if we're a veterinarian, people want to talk about pets, they're going to tell their last experience with a veterinarian, and what do they always leave it with is that expense, that cost is always somewhere it gets brought up, right? And we think about, what are the things that help the mental health profession that was just presented? Social interactions. Well, even in our social interactions, we're getting this jab because of our identity. Because we are veterinarians. And so one day I have a group test with all my classmates. And so we got one, and she was kind of commiserating. She was like, I'm having a bad week at work. But one of the things she mentioned was that, the clinic was talking to her about her performance relative to her ATC and her average transaction charge. Now, this is the classmate that was one of the top 5 in my class. Graduated, went out, became a specialist, under the age of 30, is already a specialist. And now, she's telling me this story of how she is an underperformer. The most overachieving person, one of the most overachieving person in my class, is now suddenly, by the standards that we use to say, what is a successful veterinarian, is ending up as an underperformer. Which was just an interesting concept. And this question just kind of plagued me. I didn't really know how to help her in the context of that conversation. So it was just one of those questions I took and put on a shelf. I said, one day I want to answer this and figure out how did she, of all people, end up in this situation. So a couple months ago, somebody introduced me to this book, just randomly. It's called Whistling Vivaldi. And really, it wasn't something I was normally interested in, but they kind of described the story where the title came from. And it just got me intrigued, sitting in the conversation, one click Amazon, and boom, 2 days later, I'm reading this book. And the story comes from, it's talking about stereotypes and how they affect us. Again, not something I usually jump into, but the story that the idea of the title came from was that they were studying stereotypes and their impact. And one of the guys told a story, and he was a black man who lived in the Upper East Side of New York, and he worked in financial services and had a great career. But what he found was when he would walk down the street, people would casually move to the other side of the street. And based off of his identity of being a black man, people were interacting with him differently. But the thing that got me was that when he would whistle Vivaldi, and he would remove the stereotype, and so he would whistle classical music walking down the street, suddenly people didn't interact with him the same way. And so he was able to remove the stereotype by a particular action. And that to me was just a fascinating thing of it's not this thing we think about in our society of stereotypes and generalizations, but the fact that it could be influenced and removed fascinated me. And so that's what took me on this journey of reading this book. And so it goes through, Claude Steele is the researcher, and he's the author of the book, and it walks through this journey of them looking into, and it started with, he was in a university setting, and they were trying to figure out why African Americans have underperformance in university setting. That statistically, time and time again, they underperformed. And so that was kind of the inciting cause that led them on this journey of studying underperformance in all sorts of different scenarios. And they came through over the course of that, coming up with terms and putting ideas around it. The three big ones was the identity contingency that we've talked about, looking at a negative stereotype, a widely held belief about an individual or group which displays them in a poor light, pretty obvious definition. And then the other one that they coined is what they described as stereotype threat, meaning a situational predicament in which individuals are at risk of confirming negative stereotypes about their group. And they describe it basically as any time that there is a widely held belief about a particular group. The ones they looked at were African American men and intelligence, and women in math. Those were kind of some of the starting obvious ones that they were looking at. It's like a cloud, that this cloud is just present. And it's there, and it's lingering, whether it's activated, whether it's primed, it's there. And so they tried to figure out how can we, if we remove the cloud, will they perform at the same level? And so that's what they started to look at, to say, does stereotype threat affect performance? And they performed multiple different studies. I just put a couple up here because it was kind of a progressive of they would come up with one question and they would go test it. They would come up with another question and go test it. But these were kind of two of the pivotal studies that came into that. Again, the African American men and women in math were the two big ones. And they found in different populations, whether you're white, they tested white men's athletic ability comparatively. They looked at females. They looked at black, white, teens, young, old, different races, everything. They could continually show that any group that was under some sort of widely held belief of a negative stereotype threat would underperform in a challenging situation when faced with that stereotype threat. So what they found, groups with equal aptitude, participants who, for some reason, subscribed to this negative stereotype, whether they were primed with it or not, underperformed. And when the stereotype threat was removed, both groups, the ones not under threat and the ones that are, performed at the same level. And so what does that look like? Well, in the women in the math, what they did was they would have people who have equal test scores, equal aptitude coming in. And one group, they would say, this test has not been shown that there is a gender difference in performance in the results. Something that simple suddenly removes the threat. And that group performed at the same level of their peers. And particularly, the effects are more distinguishable in challenging scenarios and in those who care the most about the topic. The ones that didn't care didn't really affect them. The ones that cared the most, it was affecting them. And so what's really happening here? Why is this happening? And so they continued on this journey to say, why? Why is this happening? And what they found is there is a physiological stress response that directly impairs the prefrontal processing that's happening. One of the ways they measured it was looking at fMRI studies, and particularly women in math. They were finding that instead of just using the math side of their brain, they're using a social emotional part of their brain too. So cognitive function is being consumed somewhere else, worrying about this thing. But the interesting part was when they asked the participants, are you stressed? They didn't know. They only found the stress response when they started measuring physiological responses, heartbeats, blood pressures, fMRIs. They found this different state was actually being affected in a bodily function. Because you're actively monitoring your performance. If when you're female on the math test, is it because I'm a female and I'm not good at this when I come into that challenging question versus just, well, it's a challenging question. What do I do about it? How do I solve this problem? And then also trying to quiet the negative thoughts or emotions that become from this self-regulation. So basically, you're having to use your mental resources, you're consuming mental resources to quiet down this threat that's happening instead of just doing the task. But when you remove the threat, then all of that cognitive function can go towards solving the problem. And so that was kind of the basis of their theory. And I was just reading this and I was like, oh, this is fascinating. But halfway through this book, I kind of something occurred to me, something triggered me of like, well, it's great in all these populations, and of course we have these issues. But I was like, you know what? I kind of remembered being on that plane and realizing I have an identity contingency of being a veterinarian. How would we take this science that's being shown in this and then look at it and apply it to veterinarians? And so, that part has been shown, and that's why I wanted to present this to the group of what happens if we start to take this and apply it to veterinarians? Are we under a negative stereotype threat with our identity contingency? And what is the clouds that are facing us that we have someone like my classmate who is underperforming? Is that potentially because of some sort of cloud of a negative stereotype threat? But kind of looking back at their solutions, they did come up with solutions of presenting that to say, all right, how do we remove this? So actively removing the stereotype, that is one of the solutions to the problem, which we kind of talked about, of whatever it is, you can remove that from the situation. Other things, growth mindset triggers. So this book, Mindset, to me, was one of the most fascinating books reading in veterinary medicine. Because I had a group of students, so we bring students in during the summer at Wilmington, and we do basically a business boot camp. And it's cool because it's kind of like a summer camp if I get to get them out of their normal situation. And day 1 and day 2, they're in this mindset where they're like, I got to get the answer right. What's on the test? And I'm like, there's no test. And suddenly they shift out of what I had described as from student mode into like entrepreneur mode. And I had just seen this phenomenon. There was one particular group that was struggling. They weren't switching gears, and I was like, what's wrong? And so when I read this book, I was like, I have words to put this phenomenon of what was actually happening. Usually I would take those students, and they would come from this fixed mindset and get into a growth mindset. Fixed mindset is where you're looking at getting the answer right, wanting to be perfect. And growth mindset is that ability to, let me learn from this experience, that ability to fail and grow and learn. And they were shifting into growth mindsets. In this particular group, one was just basically refusing to shift into this growth mindset. And it completely affected the group dynamic that happened within that group. So I was like, I'm pretty sure 3 chapters into this book, I was like, this is happening in the vet profession. And anybody that ran into me that year, I was just like, you have to read this book. But I highly recommend it. It's actually interesting. In all the other books I've read about these topics, her work, Carol Dweck's work, gets repeatedly brought up about growth mindset. And so even when I was reading Whistling Vivaldi, I was like, well, this is interesting. I wonder if growth mindset would fix this. And then like 2 chapters later, it's like one of the fixes is growth mindset. So an interesting kind of exploration there. And then another piece that actually helps with this particular negative stereotype is mindfulness practices. And doing what we did this morning, and time again, I'm like, meditation can't possibly help. But time and time again in the literature, it keeps coming up. Consistently, it's one of the things that helps cognitive function and cognitive therapy, and very much in that line of being able to be a potential solution for a lot of the negative stereotype things, or negative effects of life. And so this is kind of the basic pathway of the growth mindset. That growth mindset, they see the challenges, they accept them, they're willing to grow from them, they persist versus fixed tend to give up. They see effort as fruitless or worthless. Particularly, they ignore useful feedback versus the growth mindset or learning from criticism, and they're able to kind of take a new vision of the world. And so that idea of, I want to learn from this experience. I want to learn from this experience, not, well, I only have a certain amount of intelligence, therefore I can only perform at a certain level. So bringing it back to the question at hand was, can I apply this to why is my classmate underperforming? And so when we look at our identity contingency, right, when we're on a plane, you hear the stories, you hear the social animals, and then always there's that punctuation, right, with money, right? There's this cloud around how much our services cost. Whether we're in a social setting, whether we're in an exam room, it's just there. And it hangs over us, right? And so how do we think about this when we're looking at the veterinary medicine of this cloud is hanging over the entire clinic, right? Every time we're out in public. But what's the one thing she was getting measured in? What unit was she getting measured as her performance in? Her success as a veterinarian, being measured in the thing that's just hanging over her, of this underperforming type of negative stereotype of who we are. So the theory is this hanging over us every time we're in the exam room? Is it taking up some of our cognitive function that we could be focusing on better treatment, better communication, because we're worried about being too expensive, about being somewhere deep in our psychology, about being overpriced in these associate veterinarians that should be these high performers? Somewhere in their brain, they're worried about this. So can we potentially remove this? How can we remove it? And when we start to look back at the solutions they found in the studies was remove stereotype threat. So how do they do that? One of the ways, and this is so interesting that Peter just said this, of one of the ways that they could, in these groups, create interventions was have people get together and tell their narrative stories. That, anybody in college struggles through these things. It's not because I'm black that I'm struggling. Everybody's struggling. And they were they found that Asian students particularly study in groups, whereas other individuals, especially minorities, study by themselves. And if they put them in groups, that narrative starts to happen, you start to see. And so when you face those challenges, it's the challenge, it's not because of your identity. And so I completely agree. And I think also thinking about, the food animal things, when you think about the relationships that those particular practitioners have with their clients, it's a very social relationship, right? If anybody's been on a dairy call, you're in there having coffee, and it's a very related experience, a connected experience and a narrative experience, bringing this connectedness together, not just how much is this going to cost, and that making the decision just based off of the price tag that happens so often in our exam rooms. And one other way that I've kind of found or described to students, because I fundamentally believe that it's not that we don't stop measuring people in performance, because I think ATC is a fantastic benchmark. I think we change the story. And what I found with students, that when I take it and make it something they know, and I change the story around why we're using money as their benchmark, the light bulb goes off. Because what I tell them, I'm like, look, money, just like blood is the currency of the body, right? Every organ uses blood. And it's easy for us to acquire, to test it, to run and say, all right, what's going on in the liver, what's going on in the kidneys, what's going on across the body. It's easy access, and it kind of gives us a holistic picture. Money is the currency of the business. Every aspect, every organ within the business uses money. And we're already having to track it for taxes and performance and all of these other things. It is the lowest hanging fruit for us to measure what's going on inside that exam room. We could come up with a whole different bunch of tokens, ways of measuring it. That would be like going for a biopsy before you ever ran blood work. And so changing the narrative around why we're using money as their benchmark, that it's not about the money, it's not about charging them, it's just it gives us an indication of what's going on inside the practice, because it touches every area of the practice. So changing our narrative, not changing necessarily the tool, they didn't change the test for those students taking math, but they just changed the threat. It's not about gender. This isn't about money. This is just a tool that we can use to measure quality of care. And can we potentially remove some of this threat? And I don't know, there may be other ideas that you guys have seen out in practice that work, but recognizing are all of our associates. We look at the student debt, right? That's money too. Every angle, and I've gotten this a lot actually, and I find it very sad. I talk about money, I work for a bank, so I go into schools, and I can't tell you how many times students come up to me and say, thank you for talking about money in a positive way. Think about that. Thank you for talking about money in a positive way. Every interaction from every angle they've had with money is negative. So can we start to change the narrative for them? And then looking at the growth mindset triggers, rewarding effort of when they do those, instead of praising the outcomes of a patient, praising their effort of, it looked like you really communicated with that client very well and I really appreciate it, not the outcome of the patient, right? Rewarding effort is one of those that gets those in growth mindset, as well as mindfulness practices. We keep bringing this back up. It's one of those things that keeps showing up in the literature, and recognizing that it's a thing, and it does have actual effects. And so recognizing the value within those. And can we potentially take those people who are very high overachieving, because those are the ones most at risk, the ones that care the most are the ones most at risk for any sort of negative stereotype threat. And this was just one of the ideas I had around this, but I don't know, it's kind of let's start exploring this, let's start talking about this, let's open up a conversation to what might be going on within our profession.